Thank you, everyone who is able to come, and then those who are going to watch later on video. I'm happy to be here. I'm traveling right now because I've got some talks that I'm giving today. And so I'm in Chico, California, the land of like the Machupta folks. And I'm in a hotel right now, but I forgot my glasses at home. And so if you notice me like getting like kind of really close, it's probably because I'm trying to read smaller print somewhere. But I just recognized as I was like getting ready to set up, I was like, oh no, I forgot my glasses. Um, I I'm gonna share with you a couple of quick resources and things today. Everything that I'm sharing is publicly available. So if you need to follow up again later, or if you felt like, oh my gosh, I'd love to watch that or look at that further, all things should be made available to you. I also shared the slides and the slide deck so that they could be sent to folks who are registered and watching. I always tell people there's a lot of information, and sometimes we can get caught up in trying to like write it all down or kind of get it because we don't know if we're going to get to find it again or see it again. And I'd much rather that people kind of listen and process and think together, and worry a little bit less about writing down like bullet points and things. I always tell people just try to pay attention to what sticks with you and like what stays with you as you go out into the world after this. And if there's anything that kind of clicks together, and then kind of inspires you in different directions. It's the way that I have really been pushed in directions, I think, myself, that have really helped me to think about the role that I want to play in academia, the role I want to play in my own community. Is I really kind of try to just listen and feel through things, rather than get really caught up in like how we write things down or how we like memorize or send information like back and forth. So you will get access to the slides, hopefully also to most of the materials. I am happy to be here today. I'm going to start just really quickly. I'm going to share my screen to show you a little bit of a slideshow, a kind of introduction to me and what we're going to talk about today. We're going to watch a short video, which is available on YouTube. So if you want to watch it again or want to share it with other people, it's out there. We'll hopefully have some time to like discuss and process through what we've learned from the video. And then we'll leave plenty of time for some questions and discussions. I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're going through. So let me get my screen share up. All right. Trying to navigate this part. Okay. So I'm talking a little bit today about California Indian history and Native American studies specifically. These are just a few of the books that I recommend to folks, and that when people are like, sort of, where do I start or where do I begin, especially when I'm trying to think about like the places that I occupy and the places that I live. And I always say the really amazing thing about living in California is that we have been growing for just, I think, hundreds upon hundreds of years. Our intervention and our discussion and the ways that we want to be a part of how people tell the story of this place that is currently called California. So some of the books that I really highly recommend, I often teach an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She also came out with a second edition that is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for children, hopefully just really geared toward being able to use with like younger folks and in classrooms. So if you have younger folks that are interested, there is like a kid's version of this book. I think it goes through as much of American history as she can get like she can get into this space. It's very eye-opening. And I often teach the very first chapter, which is called Follow the Corn, which kind of helps people to reframe what they think about the Americas in general. And one of the lines that she writes in this first chapter that sticks with me so much is she says, the new world, and this is sort of how they referred, the colonists are coming over and they're saying that the Western Hemisphere is the new world. And she says the new world is in fact a very old world. And she goes through how you can understand that the concepts of like time and place have really been framed for us by a colonial endeavor to really erase history and knowledge and people and cultures and the complexity of the things that were happening in those spaces prior to sort of discovery or invasion, as California Native scholars often refer to it, by colonial peoples and systems. And so she really tries to reframe that. I think it's very helpful. On the heels of that, Dr. William Bauer worked on a book called We Are the Land, A History of Native California. This is something that it came out very recently, but we highly recommend. It's an exploration of really understanding Native California through the perspective of Native peoples and Native histories. It goes into several different eras and movements all the way up through like the early 2000s, provides a lot of insight into like tribal histories of place and peoples. So those two books together, you really can't go wrong with really learning about like how you understand Native American peoples and the world around you. On the very far right is Genocide of Northwestern California, written by Jack Norton. This is a very important book, especially for me and the peoples of my area and region. Jack Norton is a Hoopa Cherokee scholar. He's a historian. And in 1979, he wrote a book called Genocide in Northwestern California, where he utilized sort of the archives and records of the colonial institutions that he was working in to establish and write about how what happened to California Native peoples was a genocide. And this was very controversial to folks. And I will say it still is sometimes controversial to folks. And he writes in this book about how when this book was first published, he was very much maligned by the academics that he worked with. He was blacklisted. His book, like some people refused to carry it in libraries because they accused him of not telling the truth and also of sort of misrepresenting this genocide. And so he was really one of the first to really fight for this discussion and fight for how we understand genocide, especially from the perspectives of Native peoples. And then if you're wondering about my work and what I do, so my book is actually the one on the left. We Are Dancing for You, Native Feminisms and the Revitalization of Women's Coming of Age Ceremonies. I really like to write about us as contemporary peoples and really the work that we're doing now to revitalize, resurge, and return to our lands, to our knowledges, and then the work that we have done, especially in our communities around decolonization. And I focus primarily with women, young women, adolescents, but I also think about the impact that that has on the futures of our communities. Now, one thing I will say is I do think it's important to know whose land you are occupying. And so if you've never seen this resource before, I would highly recommend that you go to native-land.ca. If you go there, you can actually type in your zip code and they will tell you whose native lands you are on. It's not a perfect tool yet, but it gets really close to being able to provide this information. I'd love to know where people are joining us from today and whose lands you're on. I always tell folks, you don't have to tell me the current name, the sort of colonized name of the place and peoples. You can just say like, I'm in the land or territories of these folks. Just to let us know like where you're joining us from. You can also, and you can tell other folks, text your zip code, city and state, or zip code or city, comma state, to 907-312-5085, and they will text you back whose native lands you are currently occupying. Very helpful as you're traveling. I think it's always important to like look up and make sure you know the name of the peoples whose lands you are on. So I tend to do that no matter where I go. I'll also usually try to look up something that they're doing, something that they care about, if there's events or things that they're trying to let people know about, just because I think it's important for us to know those lands through Indigenous peoples. Now, I oftentimes will start my talk with a land acknowledgement, especially if it's not been done before, but we had a land acknowledgement today. I will say I wanted to give people some resources just in case they're interested in more discussions around land acknowledgement. I have done a lecture that's recorded. It's up on YouTube. It's called What Good is a Land Acknowledgement? I will tell you that I have a lot of critiques about land acknowledgement as a practice. Especially when it's sort of like the teeth is taken out of it and it becomes just an acknowledgement that you're on Indigenous lands rather than a step toward action or commitment of what you're going to do because you are occupying Indigenous lands. And so the lecture will help you to kind of talk about how do you write a land acknowledgement, what's it for, and then what does it mean to think about the commitment that you're making if you are going to do one. I always say to people, don't do a land acknowledgement unless you're also already on the page of being willing to commit toward land return. And I have a lot of funny stories about people inviting me like to do land acknowledgements or asking me if I'll come to events just to do land acknowledgements. And at one point, an organization invited me and they said, can you come and do a land acknowledgement? And I said, sure, my land acknowledgement is 20 minutes. And they were like, wait, what? We thought it would be like, 2 minutes max. You come up and you say, this is whose land you're on. And then you sort of leave. And I was like, no, mine's 20 minutes. And they wrote back and asked me, is there anything that we can do to help make your land acknowledgement shorter? And I said, sure, you can give all the land back and then you'll already know whose land you're on and you won't need me to come and do an acknowledgement. So to kind of think about the commitment that you're making when you're starting to make this a practice in your life, the commitment you're making to land return. I do an awful lot of talks about land back, and if people are interested in learning more about it, we're working on the final actually draft of our California Land Back Special Report, which you can find at californiasalmon.org. Right now, the draft is up there, but we're finalizing the actual report. It'll be out probably mid-May, and it's a resource for people to really understand land back in the context of California. We also had a land back symposium where you can watch all of the panels and discussions and things that we did on why land back is such an important part of the work that we do. And if we're dedicating ourselves to decolonization, what we're truly dedicating ourselves is to land return to indigenous peoples. My book specifically is really looking at revitalization of coming of age ceremonies. And I just wanted to say, like, if you're interested in more understanding California history, especially in the context of women and feminism and sort of what happens during this period of time, the second chapter of my book is really about California Indian history, genocide, and Native women. I wrote every chapter so you could kind of read it as individual chapters and assign them as individual chapters, or you could read the entire thing together, but it takes you through like a whole discussion about how you understand why our work to revitalize ceremonies, especially women's coming of age ceremonies, is so important to the work of decolonization and to the future of indigenous folks in the areas that they come from. I also do this work because it's very personal to me. So the work that I do, especially with Native women, I think a lot of us I hope more and more people have heard about the missing and murdered Indigenous women issues that are all over the world, actually. And when you really look at it as an issue of colonialism, it is something that is a pretty standard practice of how colonialism continues to make it very difficult to live as an Indigenous person, because Indigenous peoples represent a time before colonialism. They represent understandings that colonialism is not the only way that we have to live. They know a time before capitalism. They can tell you about it. Our stories are about a time before capitalism. They're about a time before colonialism. And what I'm always telling folks is, because Indigenous peoples know, because we have lived times before this system has been in place and times before capitalism and colonialism, that means that we also can functionally imagine how we could build the world after. And the fact that colonialism isn't actually very old, it's not very established, and it's actually not very strong in terms of how it holds itself together. I always tell people we know colonialism isn't very strong because they banned books. And if they wouldn't ban books if they thought the system was strong enough to withstand even just thinking differently. So as Indigenous peoples, then we face some of the highest rates of violence in the United States. I always like to point out we're less than 2% of the population of the United States. We're the most likely to be sexually assaulted in the United States. We're the most likely to have a violent crime committed against us. We're the most likely to go missing. And in Humboldt County, where I live right now in Northern California, they did a report that established that we have one of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the nation, especially when you look at per capita rates for the size of our county, that it is an ongoing issue, that it affects all of us, and that it is demonstrative of ongoing colonialism. It is because of colonialism that this issue was created, and it is because of colonialism that this issue continues. So the work that I do really is tied to the fact that this is not something that is unfamiliar to me. And in fact, this is my cousin, Emily Risling, who went missing October 16th, 2021. She was last seen in sort of the Pequon area, very near like Klamath in very far northern Humboldt County. And I think at that moment, it sort of really highlighted for me that The work that I do is not theoretical. It's very personal. It's personal to myself and my community. And it's the reason that I think that making sure that folks understand this issue is so important, and understanding the issue in the context of it being ongoing, and that it can affect us at all times. It also reminds me that my life is very much outside of academia, and it's outside of just sort of like lecturing and discussing. It's on the ground work that we have to do to protect our relatives. We still don't know where she is or what happened to her. The reason why I constantly mention it is because I like to tell folks, one, I don't know if I'm just going to hit the right nerve for somebody who wants to reach out and try to find some way to help, or knows something that I don't know, or knows somebody that I don't know that might be able to help us. But the second reason is I want to remind people and inspire people that if you do know something about anything, about any case of anybody missing, anybody murdered, that you say something. It is really devastating as a family not to have any information. And we think about her a lot. I don't like talking about her in the past tense, but I do like making sure that people know who she is and sort of why I do some of the work that I do. And I think that one reason why is because we've always been very clear that there's really a history, and especially in California, of telling stories about us, but not really telling stories by us. And the stories about us are often told in this very tragic way, in this way that centers us as being only in the past, and in this way that sort of disempowers us as contemporary folks today, when in fact we are doing really important work in natural resource management and the sciences and social sciences and youth development. And we are really people who understand this place from a perspective of hundreds of thousands of years. And so I think one thing that we really focus on is that the stories told by us are really about something beyond survival, that instead we're talking about our reaffirmation of our resilience, our resiliency, our resistance, and the fact that we were always focused on the future and the ways we were always going to be here, and not the fact that like there was a tragedy that was happening around us, that we were having to push back against it, but instead that we needed to make sure that we had things to create better futures, and we were always thinking about our next generations. So we're gonna go through very quickly some discussion around this video that we're going to have. I think what we're doing is setting up a discussion around how we understand colonialism. And colonialism might be something that people really kind of have a grounding in. We're looking at kind of the way that colonialism comes into an area and establishes a system. Here in the United States, we talk a lot about this settler colonialism, where land becomes the main focus of what people are doing because settler colonists are here to stay. So instead of colonialism that is coming in and pushing resources out, settler colonialism is like, we're here to stay, so we're going to take the land, steal the resources, and also make it nearly impossible to exist here as an indigenous person, because the existence of indigenous peoples calls into question the legitimacy of the empire. It calls into question the legitimacy of the entirety of our country, because the entirety of our country is based on the foundational law that you can discover a place that is filled with millions of people and call it your very own. And this doesn't make any logical sense, but it is how we have established the legal system of the United States. If indigenous peoples remind people that that actually isn't true and can't be true, and then calls into question those kinds of logics. And so I think that when you start to see settler colonialism as trying to make logical its very existence, then you will notice it all around you. You'll notice the way that they teach and talk about Native people. It very much takes out what's really happening in the situation. So we often learn about the claiming of land instead of desecrating, stealing, taking, destroying, wars with Indians instead of massacres and exterminations, death of Indians instead of murders, killings, Holocaust, and genocide. Colonization or settlement or contact instead of invasion, occupation, or the end of the world. And then we learn about the dying, vanishing Indian instead of the surviving, resisting, or revitalizing Indian. So to think about the terminologies that we internalize to try to make logical that this is the world and the way that it's supposed to be, instead of the fact that Native people are saying, actually, it's illogical, and we should call it for what it is and change it, make something better in this place that we can all live here together. I always say the goal of decolonization are things like we should all be able to breathe the air and drink the water. And then when you say that out loud, you're kind of like, yeah. And then so we're like, it's actually pretty logical. And what we start to realize is how illogical settler colonialism and ongoing systems of settler colonialism actually are. And doing that takes a lot of power away from the fact that we think that they should always be in existence, which then again challenges the state itself. Now I'm going to show you this short video. Again, it's available if you want to watch it again or use it or send it to other people, but I'm going to ask you to think about some questions. The first is, what's something new that you learned? The second is, what is the most important moment of the clip for you and why? The third being, what did you learn about genocide in California that you did not know before? And the fourth is, what is one question that you might still have? We're going to watch the video. I'm going to come back and show you just a couple of quick additional pieces of information, and then hopefully we'll be able to move into a discussion. So I'm going to play the video for you now. As I said, it is available on YouTube. It is something that you can watch multiple times. And I have seen it multiple times. So I will tell you, I've seen it so many times, but I also notice or learn or have something that stays with me each time, based, I think, on something that maybe I need to learn or maybe that I need to carry with me. So hopefully it makes that kind of impression on you. For California Indian history specifically, I think it's important for people to know that California has always been a populous place. It's home right now to 109 to 111 tribes, but back then you're talking about tribes everywhere. There is no empty space of wilderness that exists in this place that we currently call California. The way you know that there were California Indians everywhere is that every place had a name. There was not a mountain or a field or a region that there wasn't a tribe who had already named it. For the sciences, I think that the land bridge theory has always been sort of a first point of knowledge about Native people. But there have been new studies that have shown that there was humans in this side of the Americas over 100,000 years ago, which would mean that that is around the same amount of time in which they say people were sort of first leaving Africa. And so we are asking people to complicate how they understand who we are as indigenous peoples here. What we say is we're from this place.
And that's a real and true belief that we have. We are a part of the land, and the land is us, and we didn't migrate from some other place. We've always been there.
We've always been a part of our land, and not above it, not below it, but equal to, and we have our role. Our roles come from that engagement and come from seeing what needs to be done to make things the best way that they can be.
So all of this is very important for people to understand, because I think sometimes they think Californian people are here, but they're not really doing much with the space. There's so much evidence of like agriculture. There's evidence of large areas in which they're tending to. There's evidence of ways in which they're shaping what we now think of the natural landscape. And then colonization happens. Most California scholars, they call it invasion. So we're being invaded.
When Cabrillo was first on one of his ships in 1500s, burning of the land is what actually gave away people on that land. That was like the first thing that, colonizers saw, was our traditional burnings of the land.
You're talking about 3 waves of destruction. From the start of these waves, there's not really a time period in which California Indians can recover from what's happening to them. So the first wave of destruction is the Spanish mission system. They build the first mission in San Diego. There's 21 missions that they build in total. This is Father Junipero Serra. And they're bringing people into the missions in the hopes that they can create this labor force to be able to establish this extension of Spain. The mission system is effectively an enslavement system of California Indian people. The missionaries bring along with them Spanish soldiers. The soldiers are written about in these records as being perpetrators of sexual violence, not only against women, but also children. Junipero Serra actually talks about that in his journals. He's like, they're sexually assaulting women and children in front of people. And when people try to stop them, they get shot. I mean, it's a very violent type of situation. The mission system sort of stops around San Francisco. And so up here in Northern California, what they say about us is we were contacted relatively late in the sort of colonization cycle. We had contact with some explorers who had come through, people that were looking mostly for gold. And at a point, they find gold. And this is where you get these sort of like massive influx of the gold rush.
And it just came like overnight, and it came in hard. And life just changed drastically and just immediately in a lot of ways for California people.
They're not here so that they can set up a colony or so that they can establish a labor force. They want gold. They will kill whoever is in the way. They will take apart whatever needs to be taken apart. They'll do whatever it takes. The thing about the gold rush that people don't think about is that it was actually an environmental destruction as well. And then on top of that, they're setting up a political system and a state system of laws and governance that will legalize the genocide that they want to commit against California Indian people.
Our first lieutenant governor, Peter Burnett, saw this huge population of Indians in the state. And so he's the one that, charged the war of extermination on the California Indians. And we lost, probably around 80% of our total population in just a short period of years.
The early settlers wanted the resources. They wanted what would make them rich faster. But instead of asking the tribe to help them or assist them, they said, well, since the tribe probably won't just give it to us, we're just going to wipe them out, we're going to massacre them, we're going to take everything for ourselves.
Each region of California is allowed to set their own sort of what are we going to pay for a scalp or a head. But when you look at advertisements, what you see is that they're advertising them at things like $5 a head and 25 cents per scalp. The first year that they do this, they pay $1 million. The state of California says that it has paid $1 million for killing Indian people. The second year they do it, it's $1 million. In this region, every single tribe in this region would have some kind of stories about the violence that came out of the gold rush. My great-grandfather, his family is from Cutcha country. His great-uncle his mom had lived through the gold rush, and he was born sort of like at the tail end of this period of time. And he would always say to my mother, remember, granddaughter, you're here because some miner was a bad shot. Like, that's how close it is to who we are.
When modern contact, we had to forget about all our relations. We had to forget about all the sciences. We had to forget about all the philosophies. We had to forget about everything that was ingrained for us for thousands of years to a shattered existence.
They would take your kids from your family and take them to boarding schools. And then similarly, you were not to practice your cultures. You're not to practice your traditions. You're supposed to practice, I hate to say it this way, the white man's religion. We're going to Christianize you. You're going to follow our God.
I know that I'm a product of forced assimilation.
I know I was stripped of some of the smartest information a human being could have. And I know I don't have that now. But I know it's attainable over time. And we're on the right path.
There's all these great moments of Native people making sure that they were trying to hold on to things, like fighting back and making plans for the future. It's palpable in Humboldt County.
The Native American community, and especially the Weats and the surrounding tribes, were put through a lot. It wasn't just the Weats, it was Huron, Hoopa, Creek. We were all put through a lot during the early years. Here we are, we're growing. We're becoming a stronger nations. We're working together with each other to create a positive thing. And not only with us working with each other's sister tribes, we're working with the cities, the governments that surround us, the schools, HSU, to make this more positive.
Humboldt State University is within the Aboriginal territory of the Wiyot people. And then we have several other large tribes around here, the three largest in California, the Karuk, the Yurok, and the Hoopa. So being that we are in the backyard of three of the largest tribes, we can draw off and partner with some of our local tribes to bring that extra educational component to our STEM and natural resource students. Here at the Indian Natural Resource Science and Engineering Program and Diversity in STEM, we go by Intercept Plus. Our services generally provide navigational suggestions to students, assisting them navigate the College of Natural Resources and Sciences. We often are enriching that experience with extracurricular activities coming from an indigenous perspective. So bringing up our ancestors' practices and techniques of managing landscapes, melding them or braiding them in with the scientific method and innovative technologies.
In Native Studies, we're doing a sort of broad spectrum of what it's like to learn from indigenous peoples and cultures and knowledges so that we can build a better world, build a better way of knowing. It's about how we learn with and from Native people instead of disciplines historically that have focused on the study of Native American people.
My paternal grandmother was one of the founders of the Indian Tribal Education Personnel Program, ITEP, back in the late 60s and early 70s. Her and a bunch of other mothers and grandmothers, they were the ones that kind of started a lot of our other community programs, our healthcare programs, our education programs. I always think it's a pretty amazing story because a lot of those women, her included, had attended boarding schools. And for those women to come back from that and still understand that we needed health and we needed education and we needed a strong community.
When you talk about the Indian Tribal Educational Personnel Program and United Indian Health Services having these women with moxie, they come from a generation of women who have been having to just hold that strength for such a long time. And part of the work as tribal people is how do we go back and tap into that, because that's always there. We come from a long line of those folks who are moving forward and have had to keep their dignity, keep their pride. And although it hurts, we're still doing that work. That's what I try to tap in for the young people, tribal people in particular, but also for non-Indian students to hear that too. That it's not all historical trauma and then we're gone. No, it's historical trauma and we're still here and we're not going anywhere. We're still learning, we're still enduring.
So one thing I wanted to introduce you to before we get into some time for discussion and questions is this is actually, I mentioned in the video, my great grandfather. So this is Suwarm, David Risling Sr. He is actually my Uncle Dave. This is his father, the father of my grandfather, Leslie Risling, but my Uncle Dave, David Risling, who we mentioned at the start of this. This is my Uncle Dave's dad. So I mentioned him in the video as someone that was born at the very end of the gold rush. And he also is a person that I knew growing up. I met, I was very young at the end of his life, but I have very clear memories of him. So to think about that in terms of the understanding of time, you have somebody who was born at the very end of the gold rush, whose parents had lived through the gold rush, who then I knew as a kid, as a very, very young child, who also was very instrumental in helping us to really understand his experiences. And one thing that he was very invested in was writing and being able to tell the story, especially from the perspective of what it was like to grow up in this region. And he actually wrote several documents that he left to my great aunt, who then left them to me after she passed away. And in some of those, I take from those and I actually am able to sort of use them in my own work. And he wrote here, the Karuks, which is the peoples that he came from, received the most cruel treatment by the miners, killing males, taking their wives and daughters, setting fires to their homes, destroying their villages, taking their land for mining claims, and leaving no records or history to tell the story, but the scars are still there. And then he also wrote something that I find very telling in terms of understanding how we approach things, especially in my own life in Native American studies. In one of his writings, he said, "I have learned through my life that we were highly civilized, that of which will never be equaled. The civilization that is patterned from the materials that kills human lives is poorly civilized." And I think that this is foundational to kind of reframing and rethinking how we understand colonization, colonialism, and ongoing occupation of indigenous lands, in which he's asking us to kind of think about, what does it mean that we often learn about Native peoples as like primitive, or that they were uncivilized and that what was brought here was civilization, when he's saying, what kind of civilization was it? It was a civilization based on death and murder and destruction and overuse. And he's like, and that's a poorly civilized group of people. And he would always ask us, like, who's primitive? Like the person who spends their time figuring out how they can live well with the earth so that everybody has a house and everybody has food to eat and everybody's taken care of, or the person who says, I'm going to use all our smartest people to build the biggest weapon and kill the most people that we can. And so to rethink how we understand the role of this place and like what we know. And I also think what it has led to is a discussion, especially in California, about what does it mean that the entirety of the state of California was founded on a genocide of Native peoples. And what does that mean for us today as we continue to live in the homelands of peoples who are the survivors of genocide, and that they have very clear understandings of what that means as peoples, to sort of rebuild, revitalize, and research from that. And so you have here Gavin Newsom apologizing for California's history of violence against Native Americans in I think it was like 2019, and then also creating a Truth and Healing Commission, where he is asking people to be able to figure out what are the next steps, especially for the state of California, as we think about the fact that we are occupying lands that are the result of a genocide. So I want people to think about that as we kind of engage in some discussion and questions. If there's anything you'd like to share, either with the chat or with me, any questions you still have, as I said, asking for feedback to the video is also really important. If there's anything that really stuck with you, anything that you'd want other people to sort of be highlighted, I'm here now, and I'm very open to sort of however people would like to speak.
Please do either post the chat, or if you feel okay with unmuting yourself, that would be totally welcome. And again, thank you so much, Professor Baldy, for the presentation. We will share out, thank you so much also, Professor Baldy, for sharing resources that we can redistribute to people after the presentation for those who might not have been able to join us live. Okay, also to not, because sometimes it takes some time to integrate, really process sort of what you were sharing, Dr. Baldy. Sometimes you just have to feel it out, and then sometimes the feeling doesn't give rise to words just yet. So that's okay. I think one of the things, there were two things really I was hoping to ask you. I think you sort of answered at the beginning, always okay to restate too. And that is, how do we really show up in genuine solidarity? I think that, you named that it has become common practice now for people to, or organizations to start events with land acknowledgements, But the question is, how do we move from acknowledgement to commitment? And I think you'd shared that already, what it means to actually do the work of being in solidarity. And I feel like, again, it's not a bad thing to repeat that. So if you can maybe state that again, or in different ways, how do you think people can better be in solidarity and really resist and challenge the continuing legacy of white settler colonialism?
I think with the work that I do, I'm always really focused on land return and land back. But I do tell people it truly has always started with somebody being willing to just ask the question, why don't we just give that back to the indigenous peoples of the region? And that's like about anything. I went to do a talk one time at a museum, a very fancy museum, and they were asking, like, how do we decolonize the museum? And I made a slideshow where the slide just said, give all your stuff back. And that was it. And I was like, end of lecture. That's all you have to do. And then they were like, what are you talking about? And then people started raising their hands. And I was like, even that thing you're about to ask me about, yeah, you got to give everything back, even that thing. And I think it's to be able to say the thing out loud. You have to come into the room and ask the tough question up front, and then be ready for like the pushback of that, because people can't start to imagine a future where things are very different. And where things are happening, really amazing things are happening, until someone just sort of comes into the room and says it. I always tell people, like, we've had now really amazing land returns happen in our area. Things that I think if you would have asked the people 30 years ago, are they really going to return this piece of land? People said, I don't know, but I'm not going to stop saying that it's possible. And so suddenly you have an indigenous woman walking into the Eureka City Council, 35, 40 years ago going, hey, somebody needs to give this back. And then having people tell her she was crazy and it was not possible and it would never happen. And her being like, I'm just going to keep saying it. I'm going to keep bringing it up, and I'm going to make it possible and logical by talking about it. So I think that's a really important thing. If you're going to say a land acknowledgement, if you're going to learn about indigenous peoples, learn about land return, and start saying what feels like the impossible thing out loud. If someone's like, should I give this piece of land back? Say yes. I always say yes immediately to people when they're like, I'm thinking, I say, yes, you should. It might be a 20-year process, but we're going to be here for thousands upon thousands of years. We're going to be here till the end of time. We've got a lot of responsibility to kind of fill in. I'll also say, I always ask people to kind of think about, like, what's the role of indigenous peoples in the things that they're doing, especially like initiatives and places. If you're going to invite a person to do a land acknowledgement, I always say you should also invite them to do an opening talk or presentation on the major issues that are facing their peoples, their organization, the places that they come from, so that people are grounded in the place in which you are in. Place-based learning and understanding place is so important, coming at places. And then I say one thing that I get really excited about is people that will just be willing to start doing things just because they think it makes sense to do it that way. So I always teach students about the names of the places that they come from. I would say, here's the places we're in when we're in Humboldt County. They have native names. Use those names, only those names. And a bunch of them have started where they just use those names for the place. They don't even tell people, they don't try to correct them and say, oh, it's currently called whatever. And then they started making stickers, and they would just be like, we're just going to call it this place and stick the sticker everywhere. And then they just to start to think about, like, do we have to wait for permission from colonization to say, sure, you can rename this road, or do we just start calling the road the name that the indigenous peoples called it? And do we just all do that? Do we just all start to participate as a community? And so I think when you start to do things like that, you then get more and more ideas about the other things that you can do, the other things that you can participate in.
Thank you so much for that. I think there was a question very specifically about major institutions that are holders of land, of course, the National Park Service, nationally, also the California State's parks, not to mention probably even the UC system itself. But maybe, is there a way, Cutcha or Dr. Baldy, is there, I think you might have shared it already in a slide deck, active land back campaigns. I know that there are several, I think there's an ongoing struggle led by Pomo people around the Jackson demonstration forest, I think in Mendocino County, for example. I think there is even a struggle around the Berryessa Snow Mountain or Molokluyuk, also in Lake County. I think it straddles a little bit of Sonoma County, but you know, and again, for folks who weren't able to see some of that, that we're going to share out some of the resources around specifically land back campaigns. There are also, hopefully, Francis, if you can even share separately some of the maybe any specific curricular work that your organization is doing right now, but definitely to pay attention to some of these ongoing initiatives that we can support. Name change campaigns, of course, also. So there's definitely lots of ways we can plug in our local communities, and a part of the invitation and why we're doing this work through Matakaya is for us to center this kind of work. There was a question in the chat, and we don't have a whole lot of time. We want to respect Professor Baldy's time, who is on sabbatical, and also just folks who are joining. And there was a question about just where were Filipinos at the time. For folks who are not familiar with the broader project that this is all part of, we're actually also trying to track Native Asian American, including Filipino American solidarity historically, and some of the solidarity manifested in the kinds of relationships built between Asian Americans and Native Americans, where Native people offered sanctuary for Asian Americans during earlier histories of anti-Asian hate. There is a real rich history of this, including one that includes Dr. Baldy. Wondering if you don't mind sharing that, and we will share more of our learnings of these earlier histories of relationships and solidarity historically. Maybe we can end on that note, Professor Baldy, if you don't mind sharing your own history in connection with Asian American histories.
Sure. So yeah, I wasn't able to share a lot about it this time, but in case people are wondering, I'm putting a link to the chat so you can learn more about the Eureka Chinatown project, which is something that I think is a pretty amazing project that's happening in our region right now, and is really looking at like, what does resurgence and revitalization of the Chinatown area in Humboldt County really look like? And I will say that, you know, California participated in the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Humboldt County was a big part of that, in which they exiled many Chinese folks who had come into the region, who were living there, who had established businesses and whole lives. I would never say it was sort of like a nice, they asked nicely, could you please? No, it was a very violent removal of Chinese peoples, and mostly like all Asian folks in the region, because they didn't really spend a lot of time being like, can we establish where you're actually from? Like, you know, like all these things. They were just like, we're removing people. And I think that as a result of that, what you saw was then the violent takeover of several Chinese areas and businesses that had been established. And then what you see is like an erasure of that history, and not a discussion of like sort of the enslaved and sort of devalued labor that came into the area because of it. And I think that it's really important. But the other thing to recognize, as part of the Eureka Chinatown project, they are doing a lot of work to highlight the story of a particular Chinese person whose name was Charlie Moon. He was he stayed even though there was this Chinese Exclusion Act that was happening at the time. I mean, he was a well-known sort of like Chinese man living in the area. He was a cook for a local family, like a very like well-to-do sort of like family in the area. They very much had, you know, he had been a part of their family for a long time. And so when they came to get him, they actually had a shootout, like a gun shootout, between the family that he worked for and the people coming to get him, who were like, you can't take him away. And one of the reasons they said that they weren't going to let him go was that he was married to a Native woman, and he had had several children with this Native woman, and that he was living in sort of Native lands, and they were just like, he's not going to be separated from his family. He's not going to be separated from us. And he was able to stay, and he remained in the area. He had several children who his family members are still like living today. And he also was my great-great-grandfather. So Charlie Moon is a direct relative. I'm a descendant of Charlie Moon. He was married to my great-great-grandmother. And they had many children. They're enrolled in several different tribes. And we have like our branch of the family that we are very clear that we also have like this heritage and history. And I think it also speaks to the idea that like when we look at like the history of what happened with Native peoples in the region, there were other stories. So the story is often told that it was like only Charlie Moon, who there's like a single man who was allowed to stay. But there were other Asian folks who did stay. And some of them actually, old stories talk about them going into the areas where tribal peoples were living because people weren't going into those areas. And that tribal peoples allowed them to sort of move into the region, and then still to this day, won't share a lot of stories about it because it was really told through family histories about like, you don't talk about the fact that these folks were also living with these families, that they were able to sort of stay. And I think that that's something that it continues as we're sort of talking about colonization, even sharing stories about what was happening in the genocide. What you see is like, it's hard to tell those stories for some peoples because they grew up with people who were saying these are difficult stories to tell. And there's reasons why they're not so openly shared with other peoples. But I'm very proud of being a descendant of Charlie Moon. And I also think it's really important the ways in which we're drawing connections between like land return and land back. And then the ways that we can revitalize and restore things like the Chinatown area or these other areas that were really targeted as a result of this ongoing colonization. So the colonization didn't just come after indigenous peoples, although in a very particular way, because they wanted our land, right? We had to be completely erased and destroyed. It's also, colonization is exploitative of all peoples, including colonizers, right? But of all peoples, and really takes that exploitation to the level of trying to erase it from history so that they can sort of establish the state as legitimate. And we can all say that like the state wasn't legitimately building anything. And in fact, it is most of the time like enslaved, underappreciated like labor that is building that. And then those stories are being silenced. So bringing those stories out, I think, are so very important.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Baldy, for your time this afternoon. Thank you, everyone who's joined us. We will share out resources to everyone. That the resources that were shared during the presentation, including the slide deck and the link to the film and all the other links that were shared in the chat. Thanks again to everyone who joined us, and please share this knowledge. I think, again, as part of this commitment that we have pledged to Mato Kaya initiative towards unsettling. It includes engaging our communities with these kinds of knowledges. So again, thank you, everyone, and hopefully connect again soon, Dr. Baldy, on other kinds of projects, and good luck with the rest of your sabbatical. Please enjoy it for us, despite this little.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye now.